Good morning. I'm real pleased to be able to talk to those of you who weren't able to get to the meeting of the Botanical Garden Saturday morning uh, Learn and Grow group. I'm Bill Dichtel. I'm retired, live in Williamsburg. I'm one of the master gardeners for James City County, Williamsburg, the master gardeners there. My background in gardening is that I have been a master gardener for 5 years, and I'm one of the tree steward group. I work with the Arboretum, both at the Williamsburg Botanical Garden and also with the Colonial Williamsburg group. I also am one of the co-leaders of the Historic Triangle Learning Garden, which is predominantly a vegetable garden where we learn as master gardeners and community gardeners to grow vegetables, herbs, pollinator flowers together. We also grow for some of our food charity partners, such as House of Mercy and Fish. And we do a lot of very worthwhile projects to help with gardening in our community. I'm also the lead for the Governor's Palace Herb Garden as part of the Colonial Williamsburg Master Gardeners project. And so I'm involved with a lot of the master gardeners and was delighted to see a number of the master gardeners when I presented this live. We are recording this separately because of some technical issues. It was just easier to record it separately rather than to present it as a live recording. We had a lively discussion when I presented it live, and because of that, there was a lot of back and forth discussion, and sound and everything else would have been difficult. So I'm presenting the lecture to you, so it'll be more, I think, understandable played back in a Zoom recorded format. So we're doing this as a separate presentation. So let's get going. The point of this is to let you know that you can get going with your spring plantings now. This is being presented the weekend of March 18th, 2023 in Williamsburg. And yes, we are still having some cold weather. In fact, I'm recording on March 19th, and we're expecting a freeze tonight. So yes, there are still freezes going on, and you need to be aware of that as you plant your vegetables. At the same time, you can definitely get going with plantings for your spring crops. So let's talk about that today. First of all, a lot of people ask, well, why bother? Why don't you just go to the grocery store and buy your produce? And why bother with getting out and gardening? Well, I think it's pretty obvious why gardening is so great. It's getting out in nice weather, fresh air, great sunshine. You get good exercise. You get to watch your food grow, and you help to nurture it along. You learn new techniques, and you meet many, many new friends, especially if you're working in community gardens, or even if you're gardening and meeting your neighbors in the next yard over. It's a lot of fun. You're getting back to nature. You're doing your part to depollute. You're helping the global warming situation. You're helping the environment. Plus, you couldn't get any fresher herbs or vegetables, and growing flowers, and some people are growing fruit too. So it's really wonderful, and there's no reason not to, especially in the climate we enjoy here in Southeast Virginia. You do need to consider the climate, and as I've alluded to, here in Williamsburg, we do have a pretty nice climate for a good part of the year. Some of you may say, are you crazy in July and August? But yes, we do have a pretty good climate. And in fact, we do have 3 pretty solid vegetable growing seasons during the year. We are in the U.S. Department of Agriculture Plant Hardiness Zone 7B in the area where we live. Our average first frost date in the fall is November 1st, and our average last frost date in the spring is April the 10th. So we still have a few weeks to go before we're beyond any danger of having frost. But that doesn't mean you can't plant some plants up until that time. There are definitely some plants that we can plant and get out there and get growing in our gardens. This publication I will refer to a number of times, and I should say that along with this video, I am sending to Judith a copy of a handout that will refer and will have hopefully some hot links to this and other publications that you can refer to online. This is a publication out of Virginia Tech. Our land-grant universities in Virginia are Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. And as part of Extension, the Master Gardeners help spread the word of the great research that they do and the word that they get out to us about how to do the best, not only to farmers who are the professionals, but also to people like us who are the non-professionals, but who enjoy growing. And this map on this page does show the USDA hardiness zones. I've already mentioned we're in zone 7B down here in the southeast part of the state. And this publication, which you see way up in the top corner, right under the expert reviewed seal, number 426-331, has a number of graphs in it. You need to make sure you go to the graph that says 7B, our climate zone, and that will list vegetable by vegetable when you can safely put it in the ground based on how hardy of a plant it tends to be and how it does with its germination, depending on the climate in your location. So it's a very, very rich piece of information for us, and this is free to you online when you're planning your gardens. Narrowing down on our part of the state, you can see kind of in the middle of the map, James City County, York County, and the Williamsburg area is kind of in the lower middle part of that map. And we're right in the 7B part of that. And indeed, 7B is the graph on that publication you want to be in. There are quite a few vegetables that can do very well before the April 10th date. Some vegetables are a little more fragile, and you may want to start them inside in trays or cups under the lights, get them started, and then harden them off and transplant them outside. And we'll talk about that process a little bit in this video. Some vegetables don't do well if they're started inside and transplanted. We'll talk about which ones those are. Some vegetables need to be covered and protected, especially if the weather forecasters are predicting a cold snap. So you may need to get out to your beds and put row covers over if they're projecting a cold snap. So you do need to pay attention if you have some fragile new things out there. And then the last point, some vegetables are just summer crops, period. That's all there is to it. such as tomatoes, peppers, and things like that. So we'll talk about those a little bit more as we go along. Now let's talk about what vegetables do well in the early spring. And, these also are the crops that do well in our area in the fall when it's starting to get cool again. So our spring season looks very much like the fall season with gardening here in the Williamsburg area. Those that do well are the brassicas, those with the thick leaves, things like cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts like shown here, things like cauliflower, other things in that family can really take off and do quite well. So they are things that you can be planting early in your garden. Some of the root vegetables, such as carrots, beets, and radishes. And I would say that if you're working with children, if you're teaching children to garden, radishes are one of those things to get out there because, instant gratification, you get them in the ground and within about 3 weeks, you've got a crop, you've got something they can pull out of the ground and wipe them off. And when they're fresh from the ground, they're not as bitter as you often think of radishes as being. And so the kids really love that. They really enjoy it. So for those of you working in school gardens, remember that. That's one of those things that the kids really love to see and really enjoy. So think of that when you're working with them. The leaf vegetables such as lettuce, and in fact, you can be putting in head lettuce too at this point. Spinach and Swiss chard are some of the leaf vegetables that can be going in at this point. And some of the legumes like sugar snap peas, actually, at this point, we're a little bit late. They could have gone in as early as the end of February in our locale. So, and these are very popular because they are sweet. They're almost like a snack to have on hand in the garden. So very, very popular. I had mentioned that there's some that are kind of fragile that are sometimes difficult to get to germinate that you may want to get going indoors. And there are some real advantages to that, and it doesn't have to be anything real complicated, any big setup. All you need are a system where you can have some lights, a little bit of area of warmth without, wind and all the outside weather interfering with them, and they can take off and do quite well. The real advantage of this is that pretty much anything that you can buy seeds for, any variety of all of these things, you can start that way. You're not bound to just those varieties that you can buy necessarily in the nurseries or in the big box stores. You can go through the seed catalog and really get the particular variety that you want and start it. So that's one of the big advantages there. You can get an earlier start than you would otherwise, but keep in mind that you don't want to grow them forever under the lights or they'll get too leggy. You want to time it so that they have just about 3 weeks of growing, about 2 weeks of hardening off, and then being ready to go into the ground. So about 5 weeks before you plan on actually putting them out into the ground is when you want to be starting your seeds. And we'll talk about the hardening off process a little bit. The other big advantage is that unlike planting seeds where you don't know which ones are really going to germinate and come up, and you can get spacing between seeds, or you can have a bunch where a lot grow and then nothing. Here, you see what comes up and you can space your plants out the way you want them. So you you're planting plants that are tangible, that are growing, and so you can put the plants out in your garden with the right spacing. The one disadvantage, and it's mild, is that it takes some space, it takes some planning, it takes some organization, it takes some paying attention with watering. So it does take some time, but it's fun, it's enjoyable, it's a learning process, and it does require the process of hardening off. It does work well for broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, head lettuce, kale, and collard greens. Not so well for peas, Swiss chard, spinach, beans, beets, and carrots. And these are not my observations. These are observations of the pros who've done it for many, many years and have observed over time what does work and what doesn't work. I've seen these same patterns, but I don't have the experience that people who've done it for years and years have done. But this is based on many years of experience from people who've done it for a long time. I would have just a few more comments, and I would say that in the handout, if you go and get the handout online too, that comes with this lecture, the timing is everything, and you should count back to when you plan on putting them out, and that you should base on your frost dates and the publication from Virginia Tech that I had referred to earlier in the lecture about the best timing for planting. So timing is everything, and you should plan that out. The lights don't have to be fancy. It used to be that people were going out and spending hundreds of dollars getting rows and rows of grow lights. You don't have to do that. A lot of people have shown that you can do very well with just 40-watt regular incandescent lamps, and you can get them quite cheaply nowadays. So regular shop lights can do quite well. So you don't need to spend a lot of money getting lights. Containers, I would say, I've kind of committed a sin in this, in that I'm using peat pots, and a lot of you may have read that peat moss, peat pots, any kind of peat is kind of depleting a natural resource. It takes thousands and thousands of years to really make a peat bog, and indeed, even the Canadian government has come out against using peat. And they're the ones, they're the country that has the biggest peat bogs. They found that as they mine the peat, it releases huge amounts of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere and actually adds to the problems with global warming. And not only that, but we're depleting bogs that have taken thousands of years to develop. So they're looking for alternative sources. There's a lot of great research going on, and there have been some articles that you might look up on the internet from the New York Times that have reviewed some of the research going on. And in fact, a lot of the good research is going on at North Carolina State University. You might look at some of the sites there. Some of the alternate materials are mostly based on wood products, various kinds of mulch and compost combined. Also a project COIR, COIR, which is made of ground up coconut hulls. And there's a lot of research going on alternatives. And of course, mixing your own compost, which those of you that have the room to compost definitely should be doing that. Mixing it with vermiculite, perlite, those kinds of things can get wonderful growing mixtures going with that. Hardening off is the process of getting your new, delicate, young plants that you've grown under the lights ready to go outside. And that is a definite process where they're used to being watered on a real nice schedule and growing like crazy. And they'll get to the outside world and find that life is a little bit harsh, and they won't get water as frequently. They have to get used to not growing quite so rapidly, and not having quite as much sunlight as they're used to with their regular lamps, and having a little bit of wind to deal with, having possibly some critters running by every so often. So hardening off is kind of them getting used to the hard, cold world out there. And it's a process where you take them outside, let them get used to the outside world, bring them back in at night for a period of a couple of weeks. There are a number of ways to do that. There's a very nice summary of this from an article or webpage from University of Maryland talking about that, and that's in some of the references from the handout as well. So you might look at that. And then finally, the last step is planting in the garden. I've talked about the peat pots and the growing mixtures. This is just to illustrate. I use my own compost pretty much, mixed with a little bit of potting soil mostly, and that makes it light enough that the young plants can do quite well in it. I'm moving away from the peat pots, and in future years, I'm just going to use the trays and just use the trays alone without the peat pots, and that can work quite well. Hardening off, you can use any kind of mild shelter for your plants. So there are all kinds of ways to do that. This is an example, one that I use, but some people will simply put row cover over their plants, at times during the day. But various people use different things to protect their plants and harden off. Now, besides this process of starting some of your own plants on your own, you can easily, of course, go and get some from nurseries, the big box stores. They carry some very nice plants, and I wouldn't discourage you from using theirs. They come from reputable sources. And I have purchased my share of them and have been very pleased with the produce I've gotten from them. So I would definitely not discourage you from doing that. The disadvantage is per plant, it's more expensive. There is less selection, meaning you can't just go through like you can a seed catalog and have the variety that you would, although you can get a pretty amazing variety by going to Home Depot and Lowe's and going through their shelves and seeing what they have. They have quite a selection. And you are on their schedule and from the schedule of their suppliers. So, that's the other disadvantage there. The other option is planting the seeds directly into the garden. And number one, that's what you have to do for those seeds that don't tolerate starting indoors all that well. And what you have to do, though, is follow the schedule that I pointed out in that Virginia Tech publication 426-331 that I referred to at the beginning of this talk. And then the best of all is when you can share either the new young plants or, the vegetables that you produce with your garden mates and your neighbors and stuff. So that's one of the fun things about gardening, when you can just go back and forth like that. Speaking for this particular weekend, those vegetables that have actually passed the hardiness date as of this weekend are listed on this slide. So you can see we have already passed the date as of this week for quite a few things. And so you can get out there and put a lot of seeds in the ground, or if you've hardened off some of your plants that you've been getting started, you can start to put them in. Having said that, they're calling for 29 degrees tonight in Williamsburg, so I wouldn't do it today, but watch the weather, and you can get your plants out. And you just, as always, need to be cognizant of what you've planted, be ready to throw some row cover fabric over the things that are delicate, and watch out for them, care for them, nurture them along, and they should do quite well. The final category, of course, are those things that are just summer vegetables, no matter how you work it. So, and one of these is everyone's favorite, tomatoes. Tomatoes are one of those things that people just love to grow, because there's nothing like an heirloom tomato that you grow in your own garden. Harriet Parsons, who's our tomato guru in the Historic Triangle Learning Garden, usually recommends we hold our horses and don't put them out until Mother's Day. And while she's hedging on that a little bit, and people are putting them out a little bit earlier than that, it's really true that they do the best if we're patient and wait till that kind of timing. So tomatoes are definitely a late spring, early summer crop, as are peppers. Peppers and tomatoes are friends with each other, and indeed, onions are predominantly a summer crop, although bulbing onions you can be putting out a little bit later this spring, can be put out. And squash is very much a summer crop as well. So those kinds of things, eggplant as well, those things will have to wait until summertime. This shows a field. This is done by the professional planters. This is in the Governor's Palace garden, which is done by the professionals at Colonial Williamsburg, but they get a bumper crop of sweet potatoes out of that every year. And it's just a gorgeous garden that they maintain there, fit for a colonial governor for sure. And this is actually a garden maintained by the master gardeners, and for the Orr House Garden at Colonial Williamsburg, and that's a crop of watermelons. And they get a pretty good crop of watermelons, and yet they have quite a variety of vegetables that they maintain in that garden, and the Shields Tavern Garden maintained by that group, and they do a wonderful job there. So definitely good places to go and see what's going on there. The other thing that's really not to be put in until late spring or early summer are going to be the beans. Both pole beans and bush beans aren't really going to do well if you put them in early. So you're not going to get a jump start on those. Those have to wait until later in the year. So just a reminder, those are things that you have to hold off on. So at this point, I just wanted to talk about a few more points that you can be working on in the spring to get ready to have top notch for the rest of the year gardening wise. Gardening is a year-round process, even if you're not growing things. Working on your soil, doing the best for your drainage for your soil, trying to make sure that you do have adequate sun and protection from wind. Water supply is a concern for some gardens, although most will have access to some kind of reliable water supply. Critters are definitely a problem in our area. We are rural enough to not only have deer, but to have a number of other things. And unfortunately, we do have to be worried about whether we're gardening in secure areas. So that's always something to keep in the back of your mind. You need to keep personal safety, safety of children, safety of whoever you're gardening with in mind. So let's talk about soil. Soil in the peninsula, the soil's been farmed by the Native Americans for years, and they were smart enough to move their gardens around for years and years and years. And then, when the non-Native Americans came in the 1600s, we tended to settle in one place and burn out soil more. We do have a lot of peninsula clay, and the clay that's here drains poorly. All you have to do is dig down, and if you dig a hole, fill it with water, and watch it, you can watch it for days, and a lot of times that water will just sit there. And you can just imagine that water collecting around the roots of a tree or, some of our bigger plantings, and that's going to suffocate those roots. So, we need to work to improve our soil, either adding compost or other soil additives, not only to bring nutrients to the soil, but also to help with its porosity, to help it drain. We often use compost of various kinds that we make ourselves, but also mushroom compost, which is very good. Although if you repeatedly add it, you need to be aware that you could add too much salt to the soil. We do use natural organic fertilizers, and those are preferable to the non-organic fertilizers, which are more NPK elemental fertilizers, which tend to wash through more. They tend to be less time released, and they tend to do less for the soil over time. The soil should be tested. If you're a fairly serious gardener, it definitely is worthwhile having your soil tested. And usually they recommend soil testing about every 3 years for your garden, particularly checking for the main elements as well as the trace elements, which are important for growing vegetables as well. And also very important is the acidity, which is part of a soil test. Usually it should be pretty neutral soil, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 is the range where we want it to be. And sometimes lime has to be added to make it less acidic in our area. And that's some of the information that would come back with recommendations when you send in a soil test. Soil testing can be sent in through the extension office in Toronto if you're interested in that. So that you can call the extension office in Toronto, and for a fairly nominal fee, get that sent in and processed through Virginia Tech. Now, in a lot of gardens, and particularly ours, these are pictures of the historic Triangle Learning Garden that I had mentioned earlier on. We have a group of about 25 gardeners, some master gardeners, some community gardeners, and we have just been working on an expansion. You can see the newer beds to the right there. And the advantages of having raised beds is that, particularly in an area like ours that does have clay that doesn't drain soil, we can bring in topsoil above that, and it helps drainage. So it gives us an advantage from that standpoint. It's also easier to contain weeds and quarantine weeds. a little bit higher working level, although we're still bending down to garden for sure. But and also when you have a number of gardeners working in a garden, they're better delineated, so you know who's responsible for particular areas of the garden. Disadvantages, moderate expense. You know, you are paying for lumber, you're paying for soil, you're paying for compost. If you're bringing in compost, those kinds of expenses you need to consider in. At the same time, it's a very successful way to garden, and it works very, very well. We are working on a couple of projects here with elevated raised beds. We're trying to do some demonstrations to show that people who are less able to get down to beds at a lower level can still keep gardening if they're mildly handicapped or you know, like to garden, but just have orthopedic problems that don't allow them to get down, or spine issues or things like that, that we can raise the bed up to them. And so we have built this one bed, and we're in the planning stage for another type of bed as a demonstration to demonstrate how that can be done. So for people interested in that, you may want to come out and see what we're doing, because you may want to build beds for yourself along those lines too. This definitely can keep people in the garden who otherwise thought their gardening days were past. So, you know, that's a wonderful advantage for this. It definitely is more expensive to do that, but at the same time, if it allows you to enjoy a hobby that you've had, you know, for a long time, you know, it's a pretty nominal expense compared to a lot of hobbies out there. So, you know, definitely worth doing. So that's a project that we're working on right now. Vegetable gardening without raised beds. This is part of the Historic Triangle Learning Garden too, and we actually did this. McDonald's Nurseries was kind enough for a couple of years now, when they have tomatoes left over that they don't sell out to gardeners, they've allowed us to pick them up, and we will put them in and grow them for House of Mercy and for fish here in Williamsburg, the food bank networks, and we will get that produce to them, and so our food bank partners can appreciate that. So so this shows some of the growing of those at ground level. This works great for parts of our garden where we have pretty good loamy soil, you know, that can work for that kind of growing. We have built compost bins at our garden, and we do composting. We bring in leaves. We also bring in grass to mix with that we're sure has not been treated with herbicides or other things like that. And we develop our own compost. This shows professionally produced mushroom compost that we use as well, that we purchase for the garden and spread out in our gardens. And as I've mentioned, we do use some organic professional fertilizers. These are natural, organic. The big advantage is they're non-dehydrating. They're not unduly high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so they don't tend to dehydrate the soil as much. They tend to time release. Plus, they bring more calcium, magnesium, zinc, and trace elements like manganese and boron, which are not readily found in the regular NPK fertilizers like the 10-10-10s and others that you might see on a commercial farm. In looking for these, you should look for a seal OMRI certified by the Organic Materials Research Institute. that means that, that it is truly an organic fertilizer. We do have critters in Williamsburg. We have loads of deer around the garden. This is not at the garden, but we do see herds of 5 or 6 deer walking around the garden, and that's why we have a 6-foot fence around. We have loads of groundhogs around the garden as well, and we have entrenched around our gardens all the way around, where we have chicken wire going a foot underground and making a J, which has been effective at keeping those little guys out of the garden. And the bunnies, the raccoons have not been a problem with the fencing that we have. So depending on your situation, you may be dealing with other kinds of animal critters. So you may have to get some advice depending on what kind of animals you do have. One other concept that's important in planting your garden is companion planting. And companion planting is important. There are some plants that are friendly with others, and then some that don't play well with others. And these relationships are important, such as tomatoes and peppers do very well together, but other plants will do terribly together and will just fail, like squash and or cucumbers and tomatoes, for example, are often don't do well together and will often result in fungus growing in the bed. Those kinds of things are very important to kind of plan ahead and keep in mind, and especially if you're confined to a fairly small growing space, those relationships become very important. These topics can easily be researched online, and if you have particular crops, you may want to look at that. These relationships have been observations made over years of what works and what doesn't work. And these charts often look easy, but they're based on scads and scads of academic papers, as well as observations from many, many gardeners and farmers. So, take advantage of other people's experience, and you'll be the better for it. So just pay attention to that as you plan your garden. And then, of course, growing flowers not only beautifies the garden, but it attracts butterflies, pollinators, and in general, and just really helps your garden. It really helps to pollinate your tomatoes, to pollinate all of your vegetables, and to keep everything going wonderfully. So planting flowers, we, for example, in the Historic Triangle Learning Garden, have marigolds planted all among the vegetables because they draw in the pollinators that help the vegetables get pollinated. So that definitely helps this process. So I did list on the references, several references that are very good. Ira Wallace's book, Vegetable Gardening in the Southeast, is just a classic, and we use that as a Bible. She is such a wonderful resource, and being from Virginia, it's very pertinent to those of us that live around here. She is a godsend to our state, and we're delighted to have it. But if you aren't familiar with this book, I'd run out and get it. It's just a wonderful resource. She was written up recently in the New York Times, and fortunately, the Virginia Gazette picked up the article and ran it also. So you might check back in your recent papers. It ran about a week ago. These two books are also very helpful, and I've listed them in the bibliography as well. So you might look them up as well. So I'd like to thank all of you for listening to this. We're delighted that you attend these programs and that you support the Williamsburg Botanical Garden. Please help the botanical garden, and please feel free to come to the botanical garden and visit when you can. We're glad that you're part of our community. Thank you so much.